Hi class, in this final video for this chapter, we have to go over 3 more types of psychological disorders. We're going to talk about schizophrenia, dissociative disorders, and personality disorders. The first thing I'm going to do for schizophrenia is I am going to show you a video of a case study, a guy named Gerald who has severe schizophrenia. So watch that video now.
S is grossly delusional and thought disordered. He is currently on the following medications: haloperidol, 32 milligrams daily; benztropine B, 4 milligrams daily.
I'm doing so hot. I think and feel as though people have called me here to electrocute me, judge me, put me in jail, or kill me, electrocute me because of some of the sins I've been in.
Is this a new feeling for you?
The main thing is don't get excited, but the thing is it's not a new feeling, no. I'm scared of people.
It must be very frightening for you, though. You feel
So
like you're about to
scared.
get killed.
I'm so scared I can tell you that picture's got a headache.
Can you tell me more about that? The picture has a headache?
You want to know?
Yes, I do.
Okay, when a sperm and an egg go together to make a baby, only one sperm goes up in the egg. And when they touch, there's 2 contact points that touch before any other 2. And then it's carried up into the egg. And when they fuse, it's like nuclear fusion, except it's human fusion. There's a mass loss of the proton. One heat abstraction goes up in the electron, spins around, comes back down into the proton to form the mind, and the mind can be reduced to 1 atom.
And so for that video, you probably noticed several factors that were unique about Gerald. So let's get into schizophrenia, what it is, what the symptoms are, what you saw in Gerald. Schizophrenia is characterized by major disturbances in your thoughts, your perceptions, your emotions, and your behavior. The lifetime prevalence for schizophrenia is only 1%, and it's usually diagnosed in your early to mid-20s. It's very rare for it to be diagnosed in children. It usually pops up in your early 20s. Most people with schizophrenia experience significant difficulties in their day-to-day activities. It is difficult to function normally. They usually have frequent hospitalizations as well. Schizophrenia is what we call a psychotic disorder. What it means if something is a psychotic disorder is that the person's thoughts, their feelings, their perceptions, their behaviors are impaired to the point where they're not able to function normally in life. It's difficult for them to tell reality from fantasy. The main symptoms of schizophrenia, one is hallucinations. That is when you have a perceptual experience that occurs in the absence of external stimulation. The most common type of hallucination with schizophrenia is auditory. You hear voices, but you can also potentially have visual or olfactory smell hallucinations. You also tend to have delusions. Delusions are beliefs that are contrary to reality and are firmly held even in the face of contradictory information. So you can have several different types of delusions with schizophrenia. For example, you can have paranoid delusions. If you have paranoid delusions, you think someone is out to get you, someone's plotting you harm. You can have grandiose delusions. You think you have special power or you're extremely important. You can have thought insertion, which is when you think that people have placed thoughts inside your head. You can have thought withdrawal. You think people have taken out your thoughts. You can have somatic delusions. You think that something highly abnormal is happening to your body, like your lungs are being eaten by worms. So hallucinations, delusions. You can also have disorganized thinking, which is when you have disjointed or incoherent thought processes. So signs of this, someone will ramble a lot. There's lots of rambling. There's what they call word salad. So you randomly combine words. It just doesn't make sense. So you say illogical things. You can have what they call tangentiality. So you respond to a remark or a question with something that's barely related or not related at all. So disorganized thinking. For the next thing, disorganized or abnormal motor behavior, this is when you have abnormal behaviors or movements. So this can kind of go one of two ways. You can have too little. So catatonic behaviors, these are going to be when you have decreased reactivity to your environment. If you have absolutely no movement, we call that catatonic stupor. So you don't move, you don't react. So that is sort of one disorganized abnormal motor behavior. It can also kind of go the other way. So you can have repeated or purposeless movement, like twirling hair would be an example. Facial expressions, twitches that you just continually have. You can also have negative symptoms. Negative symptoms are when you have noticeable decreases or absence of certain behaviors, emotions, or drives. So examples of this are going to be flat affect, so you have less emotional expression than you should. Avolition, which is a lack of motivation to engage in self-initiated, meaningful activity. You just don't want to do anything. You can have alogia, which is decreased speech output. You don't speak enough. You can have asociality, which is social withdrawal, a lack of interest in engaging in social interactions. Or you can have anhedonia, which is an ability to experience pleasure. So that's all too little of something. And again, it's negative, not necessarily that it's bad, it just means too little. If there's too much of something, that would be a positive symptom. Again, not a value judgment, just too much of it. For schizophrenia, what are the causes? If you're going to look at it from the biological perspective, genes play a part. We know this from adoption research. For example, the study done by Heston up here looked at 97 kids who had been adopted, followed them for 36 years. And what they looked at was whether those children developed schizophrenia and whether their birth parents, the biological mother, had schizophrenia. So if the biological mother had schizophrenia, 5 of those kids got schizophrenia, 42 did not. So out of the 97, 47 of the mothers, biological mothers, had schizophrenia. 5 of the kids got schizophrenia, 42 did not. For the biological mothers who did not get schizophrenia, or did not have schizophrenia, none of those children, those adopted, had schizophrenia. So the only kids out of these 97 adopted children who developed schizophrenia in adulthood had biological mothers who were also schizophrenic. So there is a genetic component. Another study that was done looked at 303 adopted children. And 2 factors. One, that genetic component, whether the biological mother had schizophrenia, but also the adoptive environment, so the home life of the adopted child, and saw whether it was a healthy environment or a disturbed environment. It would be a disturbed environment if there was a lot of criticism, a lot of conflict, that sort of thing. So this would connect with that diathesis stress model. You have a genetic predisposition, but then what is the home life like? What is the environment like? So for these 303 adopted kids. Out of that group, 145 of the biological mothers had schizophrenia. 158 didn't. So that would be the 145 high genetic risk, the 158 where the biological mother didn't have schizophrenia, low genetic risk. And then they looked at the disturbed environment. If it was a high genetic risk and it was a healthy environment, 5.8% developed schizophrenia. That's similar to the rate of the kids who did not have a genetic predisposition. So no genetic predisposition, disturbed environment, 5.3, low genetic predisposition and healthy environment, 4.8. So all low. If you had that combination, the genetic predisposition and a disturbed environment, 36.8% developed schizophrenia. That's that combination, that diathesis stress idea. Neurotransmitters play a part as well. The dopamine hypothesis is the idea that too much dopamine or too many dopamine receptors are responsible for the onset of schizophrenia and its maintenance. So too much dopamine contributes to schizophrenia. Factors that contribute to this idea: one, drugs that increase dopamine levels create symptoms that look like schizophrenia. And drugs that block dopamine reduce schizophrenic symptoms. Recent work looking at abnormalities in dopamine show that dopamine levels in different parts of the brain can affect you differently. So for example, if you have too much dopamine in the limbic system, that's connected to hallucinations and delusions. But if it's too low in the prefrontal cortex, then that's associated with the negative symptoms, the decreased motor activity, the decreased enjoyment of activities, decreased social interactions, that sort of thing. So dopamine plays a part. When we look at the brain, enlarged brain ventricles seem to play a part. So people with schizophrenia have enlarged ventricles. So those are the cavities in the brain where you have cerebral spinal fluid. So this shows that potentially schizophrenia is connected with a loss of brain tissue. Because that loss of tissue, what happens? That area that used to have tissue fills with cerebral spinal fluid, increases the ventricle size. So potentially, for example, a loss in gray matter in the frontal lobe is connected with schizophrenia. So neurologically, there's factors. Prenatally, things contribute to your chance of getting schizophrenia. If you have obstetric complications in the birth, you're more likely to get schizophrenia. So complications during birth lead to an increased chance of schizophrenia. What happens in utero plays a part as well. For if you are exposed to the flu in the first trimester, you are more likely to develop schizophrenia. And finally, the woman's emotional state while pregnant plays a part. So women who experience high emotional stress, for example, if a relative dies while they are pregnant, then their child is more likely to develop schizophrenia. So there's also prenatal factors. And then finally, marijuana. People with schizophrenia are more likely to use marijuana. They did a longitudinal study and found that it's not that people with schizophrenia are more likely to smoke, but people who smoke are more likely to develop schizophrenia later on. So for example, a Swedish study that looked at 45,000 conscripts, people who joined the military, followed them for 15 years. People who used marijuana at least once before they joined had 2 times the rate of schizophrenia. People who used it 50 or more times before joining had 6 times the rate of developing schizophrenia later on. So there is some sort of correlation. Again, correlation does not equal causation, but there's a correlation between marijuana use and schizophrenia. And that's it for schizophrenia. I'm going to briefly mention dissociative disorders before we move to personality disorders. Dissociative disorders are characterized by an individual becoming split off or dissociated from their core sense of self. So their memory or their identity is disturbed. These disturbances have a psychological, not a physical cause. So this isn't amnesia because you bumped your head. There's a psychological cause to whatever your dissociative disorder is. You can have dissociative amnesia. That is when you're unable to recall important personal information, usually following an extremely stressful or traumatic experience. Something really traumatic happens and you forget who you are. You forget what just happened. It can often be associated with dissociative fugue. Dissociative fugue is when you suddenly wander away from home. So you experience confusion about your identity. You might adopt a new identity. Usually if you have dissociative fugue, it only lasts a few hours. There are circumstances, examples of it lasting significantly longer. Usually it's short-lived. So something stressful happens, you forget who you are, and you travel far from home. That's dissociative fugue. You can have depersonalization and derealization disorder. This is characterized by recurring episodes of depersonalization, derealization, or both. Depersonalization is feelings of unreality or detachment from, unfamiliarity with your whole sense of self or from aspects of yourself. And so you might believe that your thoughts and feelings aren't your own. You might feel robotic, like you don't have control over yourself. You might have sort of an out-of-body experience. So that's depersonalization. Derealization is a sense of unreality or detachment from or unfamiliarity with the world, like individuals, inanimate objects, or the surroundings. It just doesn't feel real to you. So those can go together. And it might kind of feel like you're in a fog or a dream. You feel like the world's unreal. Finally, dissociative identity disorder. You might have heard this called multiple personality disorder, but that is not the DSM name for it. It's when you have 2 or more separate personalities or identities. Each is well-defined and distinct from the other. So when you're in one personality, the other one doesn't know what is happening. So you have gaps in memory from the time when the other personality was in charge. There's a lot of controversy around dissociative identity disorder. Some people say, are you just trying to avoid illegal or bad behavior? The rates of this skyrocketed in the 80s, so it's questionable why was there all of a sudden an increase in this. But it is a legitimate disorder. Some people might be faking it, but there's definitely people who legitimately have dissociative identity disorder. There's a strong correlation between this disorder and childhood abuse. So for example, 95% of people with dissociative identity disorder were physically or sexually abused as kids. So there's an idea that the identity disorder is basically a coping mechanism for the traumatic event. You split your personality so that your core personality doesn't have to remember or deal with the abuse the other personality does. And that is it for dissociative disorders. By the way, I'm skipping childhood disorders that are mentioned in the book, ADHD and autism. I've mentioned those briefly in other chapters. Again, you can read the book if you want to learn more about those. But the final personality, or the final disorder we're talking about for this video is personality disorders. Personality disorders are when you exhibit a personality style that differs markedly from the expectations of your culture. It's pervasive and inflexible. It begins in adolescence or early adulthood, and it causes distress or impairment. The DSM-5-TR recognizes 10 personality disorders, and these fall into 3 clusters. And so I am going to hide me and go over these briefly. You do not need to memorize all characteristics of these disorders, by the way. Don't worry about that. I'm just going to briefly describe the clusters and the ones that go with it, and then we're going to go in depth on borderline personality disorder and antisocial, just 2 of them. So ever so briefly, the 3 clusters are, cluster A is when you have odd or eccentric style of personality. So cluster A is going to be these top 3, paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal. Those are the odd and eccentric ones. So yeah, again, that's about all you would need to know. Cluster B is a personality style that is impulsive, overly dramatic, highly emotional or erratic, and the 4 that fall into cluster B are antisocial, which we'll go more in depth on, histrionic, narcissistic, and borderline. Again, we'll go into more detail on that. And then the final cluster is cluster C, which often appears as nervousness or fearfulness, and that is avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive. And just a heads up, obsessive compulsive personality disorder is not the same thing as obsessive compulsive disorder. These are different things. This is a personality disorder, so not an anxiety disorder. So again, we're just going to go in depth on a couple of these. By the way, before I get into these 2 types, the lifetime prevalence for personality disorders is 9%. And first, and the most common personality disorders are avoidant and schizoid. For borderline personality disorder, the name for that comes from the 1930s when it was first used to describe people who were borderline between anxious, having anxiety, and psychosis. That's not the way it is now. If you have borderline personality disorder, it is characterized by instability in interpersonal relationships, self-image, and mood, as well as marked impulsivity. So basically, you can't tolerate the thought of being alone. You're going to make frantic efforts to avoid being abandoned or separated from people. Your relationships tend to be really intense, but really unstable. And you tend to have an unstable view of self as well. So your attitudes, your interests, your friends can change really quickly. Whatever they think, you're going to think. What you like today is not going to be what you like tomorrow necessarily. You tend to be really impulsive and engage in reckless and self-destructive behavior. And you tend to show intense and inappropriate anger that can be hard to control. For borderline personality disorder, the lifetime prevalence for this is 1.4%, so it is not very common. For antisocial personality disorder, you tend to, before I get to there actually, risk factors for borderline. Genetics play part in it. If you have a family member with it, you're more likely to do it. Childhood abuse, so environmental factors also tend to play a role in it as well. There are comorbidities that exist with this. For example, you're more likely to be diagnosed with borderline if you have an anxiety disorder, if you have a mood disorder, or if you have a substance use disorder. So that's borderline. Antisocial personality disorder is when you show no regard at all for other people's rights or feelings. So signs of antisocial personality disorder are when you repeatedly perform illegal acts, You lie to people and con other people regularly. You are impulsive and reckless. You're irritable and aggressive. You don't act in a responsible way. Basically, you have no remorse for your actions. If you are going to have this, you tend to show signs early, but you can't actually be diagnosed with this until you're 18 years old. You see other people as pawns. You don't care about them. They're just people to be abused. You tend to have an overinflated sense of self. You tend to appear really arrogant if you have antisocial personality disorder, but you can display really superficial charm as well. One of the main signs is you lack empathy. You aren't capable of understanding the emotions of other people. And so because of all these things, you're more likely to be involved in illegal things, to be cruel, to leave your job and have no plan for your next one, to get into a lot of fights with people. You just show disregard for yourself, for other people. It doesn't really matter. For antisocial personality disorder, the lifetime prevalence is 3.6%. And it is significantly more likely in guys. It's a 3-to-1 ratio, men to women. You're more likely to see this in men who are young, who are widowed, separated, or divorced, who have a lower socioeconomic status, who live in urban areas, and who live in the Western US. For women, you're more likely to see this among women who have experienced emotional neglect or sexual abuse, who've had parents with a substance use disorder, or who had antisocial behaviors themselves. There's a genetic component to this as well. So again, diathesis stress model, it's that genetic predisposition combined with the environment, the stressful life events. So if your parents engaged in criminal activities, if you lived in a neighborhood where a lot of the adults were involved in crimes or doing drugs, and a lot of your peers were delinquents or gang members, you are more likely to have antisocial personality disorder. So again, the combination, genetics and environment. And that is it for personality disorders, and that is it for this chapter.